Adolf Hitler never concealed his belief that the Soviet Union would be the ultimate target of his regime's ambitions. Fueled by his hatred of communism and his vision of exploiting Soviet Russia's vast resources, Hitler began planning Operation Barbarossa in early 1941 from his retreat in the Bavarian Alps. This audacious plan aimed to secure German dominance by launching a massive assault on the Soviet Union. While the Soviet Union appeared to be an ally, Stalin was aware of his military's vulnerability. The Red Army, once a formidable force, had been crippled by Stalin's purges in the 1930s, leaving it disorganized and poorly led. Despite this, Stalin sought to avoid provoking Germany, even as Hitler secretly repositioned his forces for the invasion. Before moving east, Hitler needed to secure Germany's southern flank. In April 1941, German forces swiftly overran Yugoslavia and Greece, neutralizing British influence in the Balkans. With his southern front secured, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941, deploying over 4 million troops in 3 army groups targeting Leningrad, Moscow, and Ukraine. The invasion began with overwhelming success. German forces advanced rapidly, capturing vast territories and encircling hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies, and many Ukrainians initially welcomed the Germans as liberators. However, Stalin eventually rallied, calling on Soviet patriotism to defend the motherland. Despite early victories, cracks in the German campaign soon emerged. Hitler's decision to divert troops from Moscow to capture Kiev proved costly. The Red Army's resilience, coupled with new weapons like the T-34 tank and the onset of harsh winter conditions, stalled the German advance. By December, German troops were ill-prepared for the freezing temperatures and faced a massive Soviet counteroffensive near Moscow. Stalin had also redeployed Siberian divisions, well-equipped for winter combat, after confirming Japan had no intention of attacking the Soviet East. On December 5, 1941, the Red Army launched a ferocious counterattack, forcing the Germans into retreat and marking the first major setback for Hitler's forces. Operation Barbarossa, initially envisioned as a swift victory, had devolved into a protracted and grueling conflict. The failure to capture Moscow signaled that Hitler's dreams of rapid conquest were fading, and the tide of the war was beginning to turn. By late 1941, Hitler's Eastern Front campaign had stalled. The rapid victories of Operation Barbarossa were giving way to prolonged battles, leaving German forces dangerously overstretched in the vast expanse of Soviet territory. Despite setbacks, Hitler demanded no retreats, ordering his troops to stand and fight where they were, a strategy that temporarily stabilized the front. Meanwhile, on December 7, 1941, Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor brought the United States into the war. Without thorough consideration, Hitler declared war on the U.S., further straining German resources by opening a new front. Undeterred, Hitler resolved to regain the initiative in the Soviet Union. His focus shifted to the oil-rich Caucasus region, leading to Operation Blue in 1942. However, his fixation on capturing Stalingrad, despite its limited strategic value, would prove disastrous. The battle for Stalingrad began in August 1942 with relentless German advances. The city, a critical industrial hub and symbol of Soviet resistance, was transformed into a fortress. Street by street, fighting ensued, with German forces advancing under heavy bombardment. Soviet defenders used the ruins for sniping and sewers for communication, holding out despite devastating losses. By September, the Germans had reached the Volga River, but their obsession with the city left their flanks vulnerable. In November 1942, the Red Army launched a massive counteroffensive. Over 1 million Soviet troops, supported by tanks and artillery, encircled the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad. Hitler refused to allow General Friedrich Paulus to retreat, falsely assured that airlifts could sustain the trapped forces. Operation Winter Storm, a German attempt to break the encirclement, failed by late December. The situation for the Sixth Army became dire. Starved, freezing, and outnumbered, Paulus's troops faced relentless Soviet attacks. Despite advice from Field Marshal Erich von Manstein to attempt a breakout, Hitler insisted on holding the position. By January 1943, it was too late. The battle culminated in the surrender of over 90,000 German troops, marking a decisive turning point in World War II. The defeat shattered the myth of German invincibility and gave the Allies hope for ultimate victory. Marshal Zhukov's next move was a decisive assault on the German relief operation at Stalingrad. By late December 1942, the German panzer units were forced back, eliminating any hope of rescuing the trapped Sixth Army. Attempts to airlift supplies to the encircled forces proved a failure, as harsh weather and Soviet air superiority limited deliveries to a fraction of the 700 tons needed daily. The trapped Germans, now numbering 200,000, faced relentless Soviet pressure. On January 8, 1943, the Soviets demanded the German surrender, but the request was rejected. By January 31, Paulus, out of options, was forced to capitulate. Over 100,000 German troops were taken prisoner, but only 5,000 would ever return home. Stalingrad was a devastating defeat for Germany, with losses exceeding 300,000 troops and just as many from its allies. The Soviets suffered equally, with massive military and civilian casualties. Nevertheless, it marked a turning point. The Red Army began a relentless offensive, pushing the Germans back across the Eastern Front. With the German forces in disarray, Zhukov turned his attention to Army Group A in the Caucasus. Soviet troops advanced west of Stalingrad, threatening to cut off German forces. Reluctantly, Hitler allowed a retreat, and by early 1943, Army Group A had withdrawn from the region. Zhukov launched a massive assault on January 12th, outnumbering the Germans 7-1. Despite Field Marshal von Manstein's tactical brilliance in conducting a mobile retreat, the Soviets reclaimed key cities like Kharkiv and Kursk by February, dealing another crippling blow to German power. In just a few months, Germany lost 1 million men, alongside vast amounts of tanks and artillery. The Red Army's strength continued to grow, bolstered by increased Soviet production and Western aid. Meanwhile, Germany's technological edge waned, with Soviet weapons like the T-34 tank and the Katyusha rocket system proving superior. Yet Hitler remained determined to regain the initiative. His plans centered on Kursk, where the Soviets had created a vulnerable bulge in the German line. Hitler envisioned a decisive counterattack, spearheaded by new tanks like the Tiger and Panther, designed to counter the T-34. However, delays in tank production allowed Zhukov to fortify the Kursk salient. Soviet defenses included anti-tank ditches, minefields, and barbed wire, while reinforcements from across the front bolstered their numbers. By July 5, 1943, when the German offensive began, Soviet forces were prepared. A massive artillery barrage struck the Germans before they could advance, yet the panzers pushed forward the next day. The fighting was brutal, with Germans gaining only a few miles in the north and a deeper wedge in the south, but at a high cost in men and tanks. The decisive moment came on July 12, 1943, at the Battle of Prokhorovka, the largest tank battle in history. Over 1,800 tanks clashed in ferocious combat, with Soviet T-34s engaging German tanks at close range. The Luftwaffe attempted to provide air support, but the Soviet Air Force gained the upper hand, allowing Il-2 aircraft to wreak havoc on German armor. After days of relentless fighting, German forces were in retreat, having lost over 50,000 troops and 700 tanks. The failure at Kursk marked the end of German offensive capability on the Eastern Front. Hitler's gamble not only cost him the cream of his army, but also ensured the Soviets would maintain the strategic initiative for the remainder of the war. The Red Army, now stronger and more experienced, was poised to push westward, steadily driving Germany toward defeat. By summer 1943, the tide of war on the Eastern Front had turned irreversibly against Germany. Hitler's forces, stretched thin and battered by relentless Soviet offensives, faced mounting pressure on two fronts. In Western Europe, Anglo-American forces advanced through Italy, forcing Germany to withdraw elite troops from the east, leaving their already exhausted soldiers overextended against the Red Army's massive reserves. the Soviets seized the opportunity to move on the offensive. By August 1943, they had liberated Oryol and Belgorod, with Stalin celebrating their victory in Moscow's Red Square. Yet Hitler, increasingly dictating military decisions, demanded the German troops hold Kharkiv at all costs. After initial resistance and heavy Soviet losses, Field Marshal von Manstein defied Hitler's orders, retreating as the Red Army overran Kharkiv. This marked the beginning of a massive Soviet push along a 1,500-mile front. The Soviet advance in the south threatened to trap German forces in Crimea. As the Germans retreated, partisans ambushed their supply lines, and scorched earth tactics destroyed factories, power plants, and infrastructure. By autumn 1943, the Red Army had crossed the Dnieper River, establishing bridgeheads and pushing the Germans out of much of Soviet territory. By year's end, Ukraine was in Soviet hands, and Hitler's armies were in full retreat. In early 1944, the Red Army's strength surged. With over 6 million troops and industrial output bolstered by U.S. aid, they overwhelmed the Germans, who relied on outdated logistics and diminishing resources. Key battles, such as the Korsun Pocket in January, further eroded German defenses. Though Hitler insisted on fortified areas and no retreat, his strategy led to catastrophic losses, including 30,000 men at Korsun and the loss of critical equipment. In April 1944, Soviet forces turned their attention to Crimea. After swift advances, the Germans fell back to Sevastopol, which Hitler declared a fortress to hold at all costs. Despite fierce resistance, the Soviets captured the city in May, with only 40,000 German troops managing to evacuate. The fall of Sevastopol was another devastating blow, further weakening Germany's position. Meanwhile, the prolonged siege of Leningrad, which had lasted over 2.5 years and claimed nearly 1 million civilian lives, finally ended in January 1944. Soviet offensives broke through German lines, forcing a retreat. The lifting of the siege brought relief and hope, though Finland, fearing Soviet invasion, began secret peace negotiations. As the Red Army liberated vast swaths of Eastern Europe, their sights turned to Belarus, where German forces clung to a shrinking foothold. By mid-1944, the Soviet momentum was unstoppable, signaling the eventual collapse of Nazi Germany and a decisive shift in the war. The Eastern Front, German retreat, and Soviet dominance. By spring 1944, Hitler's forces on the Eastern Front were stretched to their limits, defending a 400-mile line through Poland and Romania. Military logic dictated a withdrawal to more manageable positions, but Hitler's obsession with territorial gain and refusal to retreat left his armies dangerously overextended. The Red Army, bolstered by overwhelming manpower and resources, seized the opportunity. Operation Bagration, the decisive Soviet offensive on June 22, 1944, exactly 3 years. After Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, the Red Army launched Operation Bagration. This massive assault targeted Belarus, where Hitler had ignored intelligence reports warning of a Soviet buildup. The offensive began with a ferocious artillery barrage, followed by waves of tanks and infantry. German forces, lacking air support as the Luftwaffe was tied up defending the homeland, were overwhelmed. Within weeks, key towns like Vitebsk and Minsk fell. Over 300,000 German soldiers were killed or captured, and the Eastern Front collapsed. The Soviets continued their advance into Poland and the Baltic states, uncovering horrors like the Majdanek extermination camp, the first Nazi death camp liberated by Allied forces. Stalin, however, delayed assistance to the Polish Home Army during the Warsaw Uprising, allowing the Nazis to crush the resistance, a calculated move to weaken anti-communist forces. The Balkans and the fall of Romania in late summer 1944, the Red Army turned south, driving into Romania with overwhelming force. The swift Soviet advance, supported by 1,500 tanks and over 1 million troops, decimated Axis defenses. By August, Romania's pro-German dictator, Marshal Ion Antonescu, was overthrown, and the country surrendered. The Red Army quickly occupied Bucharest and seized vital oil fields, depriving Germany of its primary fuel source. Soviet troops then pushed into Bulgaria, which also capitulated. By mid-October, the Red Army captured Belgrade with help from Yugoslav partisans, effectively securing the Balkans. Stalin's forces were now poised to move into Hungary and Czechoslovakia, solidifying Soviet dominance in Eastern Europe. The siege of Leningrad and beyond. Meanwhile, the nearly 3-year siege of Leningrad finally ended in January 1944 after Soviet forces broke through German lines. The city had endured unimaginable suffering, with over 1 million civilian deaths from starvation, disease, and bombardment. The lifting of the siege marked a significant Soviet victory and a symbolic end to Nazi ambitions in the north. Hitler's declining strategy despite catastrophic losses. Hitler remained fixated on holding every inch of territory. His no-retreat policies and insistence on defending fortresses like Budapest and Sevastopol led to unnecessary casualties and equipment losses. By late 1944, the Red Army controlled most of Eastern Europe, with pro-Soviet regimes established in Romania, Bulgaria, and Yugoslavia. Hungary and Czechoslovakia were next in Stalin's sights. The Western Front, preparations for D-Day. While the Soviets advanced in the east, the Allies prepared for Operation Overlord in the west. The D-Day invasion of Normandy was meticulously planned, following lessons learned from earlier failed raids, such as the disastrous Dieppe assault in 1942. The invasion aimed to establish a foothold in Nazi-occupied France and open a second front to relieve pressure on Soviet forces. The Germans, anticipating an invasion, fortified the Atlantic Wall, a series of coastal defenses stretching from Denmark to Spain. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, charged with defending the coast, believed the best chance of repelling the Allies lay in immediate counterattacks. However, his proposals clashed with Hitler's insistence on centralized control, leading to ineffective deployment of reserves. The race to Berlin. By the end of 1944, the Soviet advance and the Western Allies' push into France set the stage for the final phase of World War II. Stalin's forces controlled Eastern Europe, laying the groundwork for post-war communist regimes, while the Allies raced toward Berlin from the west. The war's end was in sight, but the rivalry between East and West would shape the battles to come. The battle for Normandy and the Allied breakout.